Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Another episode of Reinforcement with Vic Williams, shot here out of the beautiful studios of Boa Studios with my good friends Alexa Oliva and Bert Oliva. Love those guys for really making this thing happen. But today we have one of our, I like to call him a friend, a leader. I mean, this guy is one of my favorite people in the world when addressing and talking. He's my go-to on a lot of these issues. He's a leader in Florida and a leader everywhere in this space. Professor Terrence Coonan, JD, Executive Director, Florida State University Center for the Advancement of Human Rights. Hey, Terry, how are you, buddy?
Good, Victor. Great to see you.
Well, I want to thank you for taking time out of your, I know, crazy busy schedule just to spend time with little old me here to talk shop.
Happy to do that, Victor. Absolutely. It's an absolute priority whenever the occasion arises.
No, it's always great meeting with you no matter where we are. So I'm going to read a little bit on your bio. Like I said, Professor Terry Coonan is a founding executive director of the FSU Center of Advancement of Human Rights and a practicing human rights and immigration attorney. The center provides pro bono legal assistance to victims of sex trafficking and labor trafficking and works closely with state and federal law enforcement officials and prosecutors in providing victims assistance in the investigation and prosecution of trafficking cases. Professor Coonan teaches human rights courses in law, criminology, and film school at FSU and currently serves as the appointee of Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody on the Florida Statewide Council of Human Trafficking. He has worked closely with federal legislators in drafting Florida anti-trafficking laws for the past 2 decades. Professor Coonan has trained law enforcement agencies and services providers nationwide on best practices in the anti-human trafficking field. As the leader, trainer of the National Judicial College, he has trained judges in over 30 states on human trafficking. He has served as an expert witness in federal human trafficking lawsuits, been a consultant for the White House, and currently serves as a subject matter expert on a U.S. DOJ project to increase the investigations and prosecutions of labor trafficking cases nationwide. Ladies and gentlemen, my good friend, Terry Coonan. So Terry, like we had talked before the show started, hey, give us a little update on you, what you've been doing, and where you going in the next few months or so.
Great. Well, Victor, thank you. You know, as always, human trafficking is one of the really significant human rights issues here in Florida, here in the United States, and really internationally as well. One of the great privileges I have is to work in the human rights field, but to do so here at Florida State University, where 20 years ago, they gave me the opportunity to come in and start an interdisciplinary human rights center. So though I'm a lawyer obviously by training and by career, I'm fond of saying that human rights are far too important to be left to the lawyers of the world. We need great law enforcement. We need great judges. We need great service providers. We need folks in the film world and the world of our faith-based communities, social work. Human rights, really a great mandate for all of us. And that's been kind of our mission here at FSU. It was about 20 years ago that we were pulled into what is probably still the largest sex trafficking case here in Florida or U.S. history. It's called the Coonan case. It involved almost 300 young women, all from Mexico, who were essentially deceived into thinking that there were great jobs up here waiting for them. They were forced into prostitution by the time they got here. All of them exploited typically in trailer brothels on the edges of migrant farm worker camps. That was our first sort of introduction here in Florida to the world of human trafficking. Our Human Rights Center was asked to go down and interview a number of these victims to find out what do they need from the state of Florida. A great many of them were actually children 14, 15, 16 years old. And it was our Department of Children and Families that asked us, will you find out what is it that children who are basically smuggled into the United States and then forced into prostitution, what do they need? That was really kind of our introduction to it. We've gone on since then in the last 2 decades and done a great deal of work with sex trafficking survivors. Again, many of them foreign national, but increasingly many of them our own U.S. citizen children. They're our largest group of sex trafficking victims here in the country. Our Human Rights Center also represents labor trafficking victims. That's a huge issue here in Florida. And I think probably because of our victim-centered work, we've been pulled into, as you mentioned in kind of my bio, but an awful lot of trainings and a lot of policy work as well. So this is a great field for all of us that are professionals in any kind of capacity, because it's right where the rubber meets the road on human rights issues here in Florida. And whatever our backgrounds, I love your law enforcement background, Victor, but the way that you've also done tremendous work with victims, with survivors, over the course of your career. It's that kind of portfolio that we actually need people to bring to the table, and very excited to connect with folks, through again, an opportunity like this, just to talk about what are we seeing around Florida? What are we seeing around the country? You mentioned, Victor, we had a meeting. It was great to have you there. It was the first meeting ever. It was last May, where we brought together representatives from our about 18 anti-trafficking either task forces or coalitions, as they're sometimes called. They're basically centered around judicial circuits here in Florida, and it's everything that the anti-trafficking movement is, which means collaboration, means bringing law enforcement and prosecutors together with service providers, with folks in the community that are the people that identify trafficking cases. And this has been one of the great models that I think Florida has kind of pioneered. How do we bring people together? How do we utilize their expertise? That there's really different toolkits, as it were. We've got great law enforcement, both in our police forces, our sheriff's offices, our federal and our statewide law enforcement, FDLE in particular. There's great law enforcement expertise. Law enforcement, on the other hand, is not set up to take care of victims. That's where service providers come in. That's where the faith-based community, that's where many of the U.S. citizens that are engaged in this work, that's where they have a really important role to play. It was our idea to bring them together. We got a grant to do so, and it was a great couple days. We were able to identify what are some of the trends of trafficking that we're seeing in Florida. I could actually note a few of them just very quickly for you that both law enforcement and service providers brought to us. What we're seeing, of course, our largest group, as I'd mentioned, of sex trafficking victims, U.S. citizen children. What we're learning is that we'd always known they were out there, had a pretty good idea that they were in our foster care system. They were either in group homes or sometimes in actual foster homes. What we've learned in recent years is that almost 75% of our child trafficking victims here in Florida, they're what we call community kids.
Yes.
They're kids that are still living at home. They may have an elderly single grandparent they're with, maybe a single parent. They're being exploited even while they live at home. And this has been one of the great challenges that DCF has really stepped up to. They've historically always worked with kids in the foster care system. What they've been tasked with in recent years is provide services for kids that are still living in homes with their families, with a caregiver of some sort. That's one of the really new trends, and it's quite gratifying to see the efforts that our Department of Children and Families is making specifically in that area. Some of the other disturbing trends, obviously with the connection between drugs and sex trafficking. We're seeing a lot of especially U.S. citizen children that are sex trafficked. Oftentimes it's familial trafficking. It's a parent, it's somebody in the house that's basically trading that child to support a drug habit. These are, I think, some of the ugliest sex trafficking cases that we see. It's such a complete betrayal on the part of a family member or a caregiver, but it's everything that we're seeing out there really with our opioid problems, our heroin, most recently fentanyl
Hey,
as well. These are the drugs of choice.
and Terry, real
And
quick before you go
they're
on, is this what you're seeing in Florida? Or is this what you're seeing nationwide?
both. Yeah, Florida is no exception. We're seeing these trends nationwide. It's what I train our judges on in states around the country, but Florida is no exception. We've seen a number of child fatalities, child sex trafficking victims that have overdosed on things like crack cocaine and fentanyl, heroin. And what we're seeing, Victor, is an equally disturbing trend where drug traffickers are becoming sex traffickers.
Yes,
And they're obviously using the drugs to basically control and ultimately
of
to
course.
coerce people, especially women, young women, minors, into this terrible world of sex trafficking. And we're seeing that, for many years, drug traffickers sold drugs. Problem with that is that you can only sell a drug once
Right.
and it's lost into the stream of commerce. These criminals are, again, not dumb. They're understanding you can sell a human being over and over again. And we're seeing them intentionally, very deliberately trying to get young people hooked on some kind of drug that can then be used to coerce them. They don't get the drug until it's a terrible phrase, until they've turned 20 tricks at night
Right.
for that drug sex trafficker.
Yeah.
But that's a quite disturbing trend.
Let
The
me.
third trend I should mention, and the New York Times just did a feature article on this.
Mhm.
Hannah Dreyer, an investigative reporter, looked at child labor trafficking, both here in Florida and around the country,
Mm.
and it's happening in epidemic proportions. And it's one of the areas where we still have a lot more work that we need to do. So those are just three of the quick trends that were brought to our attention by law enforcement and by service providers when we convened everyone together last May.
When I was acting as the human trafficking coordinator for the state of Georgia, there's a couple of things that I brought with me back home with that experience. One is, what have you heard about benefit fraud? Because which is trafficking of our elderly people, and we don't talk a lot about our LGBTQ community, and this is a community that when I got the training there in Georgia about this, there's not even any laws that kind of like, or benefits that kind of address benefit fraud. Have you heard about that and dealt with that at all?
Yeah, we're seeing it a lot, especially in labor trafficking, and it's theft of benefits, and it's just another form of coercion.
Right.
It's another associated crime. What we're seeing, Victor, is that especially persons with disabilities or
Yes.
elderly folks are especially vulnerable to theft of benefits.
Yep.
Now, where it moves beyond theft of benefits and into that world of trafficking is where that person is actually then coerced into doing other things as
Right.
well. But when I work with law enforcement, I stress that, look first for theft of benefits. Is there somebody taking somebody's Social Security benefits, their retirement benefits, anything like that? And then after you scratch that surface, look even beyond that. Is there actual coercion for either forced labor or sex trafficking? And increasingly, we're seeing that in persons with disabilities, that they're another vulnerable group. One of the things we've learned, Victor, and I think you probably saw this in your years with Homeland Security, was that traffickers go after a
Of
vulnerability.
course.
And the first vulnerability that, say, 20 years ago came to our attention, undocumented immigrants,
Right.
somebody that could owe a debt for smuggling, or somebody that could be threatened with deportation will report you to U.S. law enforcement if you don't do such and such a thing.
Right.
That was our first vulnerable group, this idea that, and we thought mostly of women and girls. That was the kind of primary group we initially thought of. We now understand that it's also men and boys,
Hmm.
but we're also understanding that vulnerabilities go way beyond immigration. That, again, we're seeing U.S. citizens. We've seen cases here in Florida of African American men living in homeless shelters who were exploited in the Palatka area for labor trafficking. And the trafficker recruited them specifically from shelters, knowing nobody will miss them.
Yeah.
They don't have a family most likely. knowing that a lot of our homeless citizens are transient. They may move from shelter to shelter, city to city, and this trafficker capitalized on that, and he recruited men, many of them U.S. veterans. This is what still
Yes.
angers me,
Yeah.
who were down on their luck.
Yeah.
And again, had substance abuse issues, maybe with drugs or with alcohol. They were basically taken to Palatka, where they were literally enslaved. Their habits were fed every night. The trafficker provided drugs, crack cocaine, alcohol, cigarettes, whatever their sort of substance of choice was. And then they were worked 60 to 70 hours a week, received almost no pay. On Fridays, they were told, here's how much money you should have owned or should have earned, but here's what you owe me for the crack cocaine that I provided you. So
Right.
it was modern day slavery, labor trafficking right here in our own, in the Sunshine State. And it still angers me that it was veterans, that this was what they came home to. And yeah, they were down on their luck. They were
Right.
homeless, but a reminder that that's another vulnerability. So too, that U.S. citizen runaway child, possibly that person with disabilities. These are many of the other sort of vulnerabilities that we're seeing traffickers absolutely capitalize on.
Well, you're talking about, I tell people today as I continue to learn, because, when we live in this space, we never stop learning. And I tell people today, human trafficking is the results of a lot of things that have already gone wrong in somebody's life. And when I work in my organization, Quest to Freedom, these are the things that I talk about. When you mention, vulnerabilities, a lot of vulnerabilities start at home from trauma, as you know. And unresolved trauma creates vulnerabilities, and that's what, you just mentioned that traffickers seek to exploit. I want to hit you with this. This was another thing that I brought from Georgia. We have a gang association in Georgia that we ended up doing a presentation to in one of their conferences. And I sat through the conference, and the outcome ended up being that the gang association realized that they not only had a problem with gangs, that there's trafficking in every part of a gang situation. And when we looked at cases of thousands of gang cases, we may have had like 4 human trafficking cases attached. So what happened in Georgia is that the gang association created a situation where we came up with a course that certified all gang investigators in human trafficking. So they're not just looking for that, gang stuff, they're searching for human trafficking. One of the things in doing this process and research, I found, and this is what I saw, outside of sex trafficking, there's almost a particular gang, like labor trafficking, if you will, in every gang situation, right? Depending on the state law. For instance, coercion was Georgia law, right? The threat of hurting you, right? So isn't that a gang? You don't do what I tell you to do, this is what's going to happen. And in the research, we only saw one case in America of this, and this was in Utah, where they actually charged the gang guy with labor trafficking in this situation. But then there's this concern, do we make that a defense for everybody that's part of a gang? But there's definitely trafficking there, right? And I wanted to know, have you worked with the gang investigators? What are they doing? Have they been trained to look for this in this space?
Yeah, and Victor, that's great that you mentioned that. Great that you helped them connect the dots in Georgia too. Forced criminality. This is one of the classic crimes that we're seeing, and it's labor trafficking. And this often happens in a gang situation. And you're right, that Utah case was the first one where a gang was prosecuted for labor trafficking. And they're actually doing trainings on that case nationwide because, yeah, this is one of these situations. And from the judicial perspective, it's this tough one. It's the same way that we actually at times have to, when we look at, say, a young woman who's a bottom to a pimp, and that she's both a victim and a victimizer, usually.
Right.
That typically she was exploited through sex trafficking by that pimp, but she's become his bottom. She's become his trusted associate. She does a lot of his recruiting, his arranging. She may do a lot of his enforcement. And judges around the country and law enforcement are having to kind of weigh this idea that oh, she's both a victim, but
Yeah.
she's also a victimizer.
Yeah.
How do you
Balance. Yeah.
reconcile that? How do
Yeah.
you deal with that in a
Yeah.
court situation? The same is true with forced criminality as a labor trafficking charge. That you'll see young men generally in a gang. Forced criminality is what they've experienced. They may also be perpetrators, in a
Yes.
different sense. So these are the kinds of more complex issues that our prosecutors and our judges are also having to confront. That it's not a black and white
No.
world of just perps on one side, victims on the other. There's a lot more gray area, and that's where a lot of our trainings and our law itself has to be moving in the meantime. But yeah,
And
labor trafficking of kids is major. What this New York Times article pointed out is that many of these kids are kids that have crossed the southwestern border in the last 5 years. I mean, this is what's really changed immigration wise, is that now when I worked for the Justice Department. This was over 20 years ago. Right after I finished law school, I was in South Texas working with immigration judges.
mhm.
And the cases that we saw there were, for the most part, young men, 18, 19, 20 or older, crossing the US border looking for work. Now what we're seeing is a very different dynamic. It's children. It's kids fleeing violence from MS-13 in Honduras or Guatemala,
Yeah.
young women fleeing sexual violence. They're coming as unaccompanied minors. That's the legal term. And they've presented a whole new dilemma. I mean, actually, first for Obama, then for Trump, now for Biden. What do we do when it's children that are crossing in an undocumented
Yeah.
fashion into the United States, oftentimes fleeing life-threatening situations?
Right.
But how do we care for them? And many of them we're now finding are being trafficked, sex trafficked, but increasingly labor trafficked around the country. That's what this New York Times article looked at. It looked at how
Yeah.
in food processing plants, agriculture, basically working in 7-Eleven stores or restaurants or hotels. These are children, and again, oftentimes having to pay off a smuggling debt, oftentimes needing to send money home to a really just, impoverished parent back
Right.
in their home country. So that's posed another whole challenge for us. And it's children that are both being labor trafficked and potentially sex trafficked. So
Well,
that's a new dynamic just in the last couple of years that we're having to deal with.
as this show goes on and using my contacts, I actually got in the queue. Hopefully, will be coming on the director of the new Human Trafficking Center. I was an agent with him in Atlanta, and he's the director of that center. So I got him coming on, and maybe I'll ask that question. But, this is so political, and I don't want this show to be political. This show is educational, and it's helping people to learn our issues. But that border issue is serious. I mean, it goes to the point of when you're talking about, like, how do you measure somebody's wrong? I know state of Florida's been leaders in this sense. Miss Rundle here, Kathy Rundle, doing a great job, in this area where if you've been a victim of human trafficking and any crime that you committed during that time, they vacate that crime. But how do you vacate when like, for instance, there was a 18-year-old that was in a home that trafficked a 13-year-old. Now, I know that 18-year-old has to pay for that crime. The question is how much leniency, because obviously she was, damaged herself. And you always got to ask the question, what happened to these people that treat other people that way? Everybody hates the trafficker, but we better start asking that question because they're part of the process. And I always say that trafficker came probably from the same home the victim came from, And so we have to start addressing this. But just going back to what you were saying, how do you measure that mental process of fear that if I don't make these girls do this stuff, when you go back to the bottom girl, how do you measure that? Because there was a movie that came out recently on Hulu. I don't know if you saw it. It's a true story. It's called Stolen Youth. It's on Hulu.
Haven't seen it. No.
You got to watch it. You want to look at it's about this father who worked with Carrick. He was the New York commissioner, And this
Yeah.
guy was his best
Okay.
friend. It's a true story. This guy was in the military, had done a lot of things, but he went to jail for fraud. And when he got out of jail, he went to this particular college up in New York where his daughter was attending and ended up sleeping on her couch and trafficked her friends. But the key thing in that story was two things for me. If you really want to see what manipulation looked like, I mean, this guy was the master, what he did to these kids. He had three siblings turn completely against their parents, right? Make them believe that their parents was part of a conspiracy against him. And that's how fragile our minds are. But the other thing that really made me upset about this movie is that us, the so-called experts that work in this space, we know how fragile the mind is. But one of the victims in this crime, they ended up prosecuting I think it was for money laundering because her mind had not yet, I would say, reset in a sense and was still vouching, oh no, he's a good guy. You know how it is, that trauma bonding stuff. And they didn't recognize the trauma bonding. It wasn't like she killed anybody. You know, she just hadn't cleared yet what this person had done to her. Her trauma bonding hadn't healed. And they prosecuted her for it. And it upsets me when people in our space, especially law enforcement, that work in this space and don't get it to that level. Because this is, can you speak on that,
Yeah. And that's that tough call that, law enforcement, they, due diligence, they have to go after any kind of criminal offenses. What we're starting to see, though, Victor, and I see it just, having worked in the legal and the criminology field for a couple decades now, is that this increased respect and actually reliance on people with social work background, people who are therapists, that they have training on trauma that, those of us who are lawyers, we didn't get it in law school. Law enforcement doesn't necessarily get it. We need more trainings for our law enforcement prosecutors and judges on, hey, what is trauma? How does it impact? You mentioned I've trained judges in about 35 states now. A significant part of that is an introduction to trauma. And it's basically brain scientists and therapists that are teaching us an awful lot more about what they've been learning, say, in the last decade or two. How, and especially when it impacts children, that it literally changes a child's brain. It physically changes a child's brain. Their reasoning process is different. And those are the things that we all need training on as professionals. I continue to learn so much. I mean, you mentioned, Victor, being a forever student. I join you on that. It's like I'm reminded every day. Of course, teenage children in your family also provide you the service of daily reminding you how much you don't know, how much you don't know about the world. But I don't need teenagers in my family. I'm made aware of that just working every day in the law enforcement or the anti-trafficking world, the human rights world. Constant learning process. But you're right, we all need that training. And in the anti-trafficking field, some of the really important expertise is basically coming from the service provider side. It's coming from social workers, folks that study the brain, therapists, folks that's their toolkit, and what they have to teach the rest of us is really, really important.
We're gonna be closing out here, but I want to hit you with two more things before we let you go from your expertise, because I know you work in Tallahassee very closely with cases. Two things. I remember, all right, I'm not even going to go there, but I'm just going to ask this question. What are we doing when we understand victim-centered trauma-informed, right? And I remember when we started the task force, the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force years ago, as we were learning, we had these battles because law enforcement want to put bad guys in jail. Service providers want to take care of, their victims, right? And they had to teach us, like, look, I don't care. You can take her or take him, but they're not going to be any good to your investigation because they're still traumatized. So I always say the victim service people are the most important people in the room. And, law enforcement with our egos, we're the most important. No, we're not. because they are the people that's going to help our victims regain their lives to be able to prosecute or to sit on a stand and testify against these people who victimize them in a way. So one of the things I want to ask you, where are we going with building cases without victims? I know it's been done. Do you see any progress in that? I think that's where we got to go with this. Like people say, if somebody's murdered, we prosecute murderers without a body. Why aren't we looking at this in that way?
Yeah, that's the great question. And the great answer, Victor, is that we are. Both our state prosecutors here in Florida and our federal prosecutors have done cases now that don't require victim testimony. And, sort of the conventional wisdom for many years, it's exactly what you just said. Hey, without a victim, you don't have a case. And service providers were right in often saying that.
Yes.
But what we've got now are some really good, savvy law enforcement and prosecutors that, especially through forensic evidence, the ability to get to social media websites to basically show, hey, here's how and where this child was advertised. You can get all kinds of supporting information, collateral information that then does not require that child to have to be on the witness stand. And that's been a great advance. And we're still seeing it. Some of the cases still being appealed, but it is a really, really promising trend. But it takes a great deal of work on the part of our detectives in particular and our prosecutors to be able to build that kind of case. But that is one of the great promising practices. And yeah, it's being pursued right here and piloted here in Florida. So hats off to both the law enforcement and both our federal and our state prosecutors that are doing that.
No.
One area that we still have a ton of work to do, Victor, and Kathy Fernandez-Rundle has been really articulate about this. We've got to get rid of what's called deposition by right.
Yes. I was going there next.
Okay. Victor, great minds think alike. But yeah, what we've learned, like what you just said, you can't put a child through cross-examination on a witness stand in a court setting. That's devastating. At the same reason, or at the same time, you've got children that Florida has this, we're one of only 6 states that still allows it. It's a barbaric practice that says attorneys can depose kids, child sex trafficking victims, child sex abuse victims. The attorney and the defendant, in a sense, have a right to subject that child to an adversarial hearing, an adversarial deposition in which they're under oath. They don't necessarily have an attorney. There's no judge present. There's no referee, in other words.
Right.
And we've had kids commit suicide after a 7 or 8 hour ordeal like this. And we do have a bill that has just been proposed here in Florida, HB 7045, one of the really important bills that I'm hoping moves through the legislature, because it would finally put Florida on the side of the angels. We would basically say, we will not depose children, that we won't have at least deposition by right, meaning that any attorney has the right to insist on that deposition.
Now and Terry,
there's other ways to get that information, videotape things, but not a 7 or 8 hour deposition.
And that's just for children. And what people got to understand is like, and just give it to them like a 5-year-old. If a child is raped by five guys, and each of those people have 5 different attorneys, they get to pull this child into this room and ask this child questions that don't even pertain to the case.
No.
Did you ever have sex before? And all this stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the case. But let me ask you, I know she's been fighting to have that law just to address kids under the age of 18 that are sexually assaulted or whatever. But that's not going to apply for adults at the end of the day? Because, really, that's like...
Not in its current form, Victor. And I agree, we should extend that. Obviously, that turning 18 is nothing magic happens.
Right.
You still have the trauma, you still have the same kinds of adverse childhood experiences, the exploitation you've already suffered. But children are different, that the law does deal differently with children. And that's why I understand that it's a good logical starting place to
Yeah.
first establish this
Yes.
concept with
Yeah.
children. The law
Yes.
privileges childhood in the same way that we say children can no longer consent to prostitution. By
Yeah.
definition, they're victims. No such thing as a child prostitute. We wouldn't even use that term now. So we're moving in that direction. But right now, the focus is on children.
Right.
And you mentioned politics too. Politically, that's really important. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on,
Yeah.
there's broad-based understanding. We got to protect our kids. And
I'll,
that's a good starting
I
point.
always say if we can't protect our kids, how do we protect the people who are involved in this, who probably started as a child, you know? I'm going to end with this, Terry. Man, I could talk to you forever because I always learn from you, and I know you're doing so much. So there's two last final questions I want to ask. I know we got the annual meeting coming up. What are your hopes in this meeting? I know you bring us together with talk about new trends, talk about what we're seeing. One thing that came out in the last meeting, I wanted to ask, are there any movement on this? Because, that's always my thing. Having human trafficking on police reports. Any movement on that? Because, if we get that, there's two things that happen. Number one is that we can get better numbers for cities and states. And then number two, law enforcement got to learn. Then they have to learn what it is. And that's always been the struggle of breaking the cultural mentality of law enforcement, which is mostly men, to understand, the situations about this crime.
And Victor, the short answer is we don't have that yet. For me, it's a no-brainer. Why don't we put this on our arrest records in the same way that we do domestic violence? This is what we did 30 years ago, and there was that same resistance. No, we don't want to have our officers be looking at domestic violence. But Florida wisely did, and they said to their officers, if you even see a dimension, some glimpse of domestic violence, check this box. The arrest doesn't have to be for domestic violence. It could be for assault, drugs, anything. But if you think there might be some element of domestic violence, check this box. And what it led to, number one, much better data and much better understanding on how prevalent domestic violence was.
Yeah.
We're at that exact same position with human trafficking. And Victor, as you know, since 2019, we've had required human trafficking trainings, 4 hours for every sworn officer in Florida.
Not
so
enough.
The trainings are there. They have that awareness. It's not that they've never been exposed to this. So why not check that box, have another box. It's cost-free. I mean, it's almost no cost at all to the state of Florida.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, it would get it squarely on our law enforcement screens, even more so than the training, and it'd give us data.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping next year someone in the legislature will take up that fairly simple proposal.
Well, I'm gonna close out with this. Any lasting words you like to leave the audience about your opinion? I know you've been in Kosovo. You're back to traveling. I know you had been shut down for a while because of COVID, but you're back out in the world, sharing your experience and knowledge with people to help their communities and their countries. Any lasting words you like to leave with us to help us grow in this space continually and educate us?
Hey, the great thing for me as an educator and as a human rights advocate too, understanding that, man, it starts right at home. That it's
Yes.
good to be thinking about Kosovo or Asia or Africa, but oh my God, let's start in our own backyards. Because by the way, we are connected through globalization. Products that we're buying that might be the products of slave labor. We all need to start asking questions. One of the things I have my students do, Victor, is it's called slaveryfootprint.org.
Yeah.
And if you get on Slavery
Yes.
Footprint, it'll tell you what things that you buy on a routine basis
Yes.
might involve slavery
Yes.
somewhere in the production chain.
Hey,
I recommend that.
No, you
for
say
everybody.
that real quick. I hate to cut you off, but you say that. I remember taking that test years ago, and I had 44 slaves working for me. And I took it recently before I started my organization, and now I got 40 slaves working for me. But I also saw recently online, and I use it now in educating people. If we have a cell phone, we buy food, and we buy clothes, we got a minimum of 40 to 60 slaves working for us. That's the number. And that's what I tell people. do your fair trade, do your homework. I just want people to just understand it's not just sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is 60 to 70% of all trafficking when you look around the world. And I don't know why experts are still saying drugs is the number one crime. How do you factor in that cost? That not everybody that has cell phone buy guns or drugs, but they got a cell phone. It's the number one crime in the world.
Yeah. And like you said, it's about awareness, Victor. Yeah, asking what products do I buy? The companies, get on their websites and find out what are they saying about what they're doing to combat human trafficking. I try to research more and more. It's hard to do.
Yeah.
We live in America. We buy so many things, but just to try to research what are some of the go-to items that we buy, and as consumers, can we buy it from somebody else if we don't like what one company is doing? We have a lot of power as consumers, and that's the other great lesson that my students and I talk about. Where we spend our dollar can make a huge difference in helping get rid of modern slavery.
Terry, this is an assignment for FSU and your program. This would be great. Check this out. So we got Fair Trade America. They usually work in the agriculture area where you can tell, like I used to tell people after a presentation, now that you know, what are you going to do about it? Now I actually give them something. I say, well, if you eat chocolate, you buy coffee, just fair trade it and make sure that product. But they ask, what about other products? Is there a site where people can go and just fair trade every product? Maybe this is something that your guys could take on. Like, how can we check all of our products, not just the farming stuff? Is there a site for that?
Yeah. I don't know if there is, Victor. That's a great thought. There are individual sites. The other great thing, though, is to avoid fast fashion. There's a great movie called The True Cost that I show in my human rights film class, and it looks at what are these products that come to us, and oftentimes it's cheap fashions.
Right.
So it's stuff that H&M and all of our big fashion retailers do, and it's basically oftentimes the product of slave labor, child labor, women that are being labor trafficked. And asking the questions about where we get our clothes is important, but also buying clothes secondhand. There's some great new websites out. Don't buy your clothes new. Get on this website and trade clothes, or buy it from somebody that's donating to this website, so that we don't continually buy new clothes. That's the other sort of, if you want to call it, sort of original sin that we have as Americans. Yeah. We buy loads and loads of clothes every year. So that, and as you mentioned, fair trade it. Look at the different things that we buy. Can we find a fair trade alternative?
I keep saying I'm gonna close. I keep saying I'm gonna close with this, but I'm really gonna close with this. I just want to thank you again, Terry, for taking. I know you're like very busy. You have no idea how honored I am that you really take the time to come on with me and share your thoughts. And I look forward to seeing you next month up in Orlando as we continue to fight this fight and educate and share and see where we go. And please, anything I could ever do for you, you can always call.
That's great. Victor, I look forward to our paths crossing as always, and I love being on your team.
Thank you, Terry. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Terry Coonan. Take care, my friend, and have a blessed day. Give my best to your family.
Good. Thank you, Victor, and look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, buddy.
Great.
Take care.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.